Hi guys, and welcome to the Crouch Ranch. It is time for our Thursday live stream, and this week I'm going to be doing some chick chat, meaning meat birds, meat chickens. So we're going to talk a little bit about, and this is probably going to be not all in today's live. We're probably going to stretch this out into this week and next week is what I'm thinking, because I don't think we'll get through everything today. Otherwise it'd be a very long live stream. So, meat birds, guys, if you're contemplating getting your own meat chickens to raise, some things that you need to think about. So first off, there's a couple different kinds. You've got your Cornish cross, which you'll hear referred to as jumbo cross, jumbo Cornish cross rocks. You'll see it with a little X symbol usually. All of those are basically the same thing. They just, it's all the same basic white chicken that you would get at the store. It's the same breed of chicken that you would buy typically at the store. There's also Freedom Rangers. Those take a little bit longer to grow. There's several different kinds. There's the dark Cornish, which is more of a dark meat bird, and they're a little bit more scrawny, I would say. You can also keep those over to breed some along with the Freedom Rangers. You can do that as well. The Cornish, you cannot really breed them. They do occur in nature at that size, but they don't breed, so they're sort of like test tube babies. That line is encouraged to continue. That is the breed that we do. You do get a little bit of a larger bird in a shorter amount of time. Those birds are ready from the time they hatch until butchering day, and you can stretch it out depending on the size bird you want. We'll get into that in a minute, but you can butcher them at 4 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks, and you can do them at 12 weeks as well. Beyond that, you're going to start having some problems potentially with those birds. They do not have long lives. Their hearts, they're so big that generally their hearts can't take it, and their hearts usually give out on them, or their legs break because they just get too big for their own little bodies. So they do have shorter lifespans. So you do want to make sure that you plan your butchering ahead of time. This is another important thing. Once you've decided that that's the breed that you want to get, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, because that is the breed that we do, is the Cornish. You want to decide, okay, I'm going to have, X amount of birds on this date, and there's different hatcheries that you can get the birds from, or you might be able to find some locally at a hatchery near you. We use McMurray Hatchery for ours. We've had real good luck with those birds. I have no complaints about dealing with the hatchery. They're very great when I've had to call and talk to them about things. They have great customer service. So those are who we use. And usually most hatcheries will have a minimum order of 50. So if you don't want to raise 50 yourself, that's another thing to think about. You can go in on it with somebody else. You take 25, I take 25. I've seen people order large batches and then sell off part of the batches, the chicks, to other people, sort of like a Craigslist or Facebook scenario kind of thing, because it's just more birds than they want, because they're just using it for personal use. Although if you have your own little farm, your own little setup, you might want to think about how many birds overall do you want to do, and what's your game plan for processing and selling and all of that. So that's another thing to consider when you're getting into that. So you definitely want to decide what your butchering schedule is when you're sitting down and planning out your ordering schedule. I typically order 3 batches of 50 of the meat chickens. And I space them out to arrive 4 weeks apart. The reason I do that is because that helps me plan my butchering schedule. We like to do some of them at 4 weeks because you get that Cornish game hen size, and somewhere around 4 weeks. And again, that's going to vary depending on how you're keeping them and how you're raising them. And we'll get into that in a minute. But we like to do some at 4 weeks at the Cornish game hen size, which is going to be somewhere between the, like right around the 1.5 to 2 pound range, somewhere in there. That's your Cornish game hen, or we like to call it the personal pan chicken, which is your fancy birds, and you can put some sauce on it or whatever. But those are sort of like a one person bird, and those cook pretty easily. They're pretty tender, very easy to butcher, and you can alleviate some of your birds out of that first batch is kind of how we like to do it, just to kind of ease us into it. So plan your butchering schedule. Think about like, okay, at 4 weeks, I'm going to do X amount of birds. Okay, and then at 8 weeks, I'm going to do the remainder of those 50 or the remainder of my 10 or whatever. But you do want to make sure you keep an eye on that, because time can get away from you. And especially if you're doing it by yourself. If you're just a family that wants to raise the birds and have them in their backyard or out in their field, you want to think about the fact that, Sissy's got a soccer game all day Saturday, and so we can't butcher this weekend, and next weekend's busy too, and the weekend after that's busy. Before you know it, you have birds that are like 3 months old and dropping dead on you, because now it's the heat of the summer is getting to them and they don't do well in the extreme heat. So then you've got birds just dying on you. So you don't want that. You want to make sure that you plan when you're going to butcher and stick to that schedule. These birds don't do well in either extreme cold or extreme heat. So you do ideally want to do the majority of your birds in spring and early summer. And you want to ideally be done with butchering your last set of birds probably by, like, in most places, and again, it's going to depend on where you are exactly, but by most places, the end of June, beginning of July at the latest, I would say, for most people. We have pushed it out farther before, and it 1 year did cause a problem for us, because we did end up having a giant heat wave where we got up to 114 degrees in the shade here, and I lost some mature meat birds that were set to be butchered that weekend. So that was a bummer. So just something to keep in mind. Plan that butchering schedule ahead of time so that you know, and you don't let the time slip away from you if you're just doing your own little backyard poultry experiment. Keep that in mind, because you'd hate for all that hard work to go to waste and for the birds to suffer, or, so something to think about. Where you're going to put your birds is another one. So you've got these birds, you've scheduled out your shipment, you've got some birds coming, and whether you've got 5 birds that you're getting at the Tractor Supply because they ordered a bunch and you've got access to those, and you bought 5 of those or whatever, you're still going to have to brood these birds. They're going to be a few days old typically by the time you get them. Even if you get them from the hatchery, they'll usually, by the time they get to you, they're usually 2 to 3 days old. So they still need to be on heat. So you've got to make sure that you've got heat lamps going. We like to do 2 so that we have a backup, so that if one bulb dies, the other one is still there. You're not going to come home to dead birds or wake up in the morning after you had freezing temperatures in the spring at night and a frost that came late in the season, which we had this year, and wake up to dead birds, because that actually happened to us. But didn't wake up to dead birds because I had a backup light. So having 2 heat lamps going, especially if you're doing a large quantity of birds, like I said, I have 50 at a time in the brooder. I highly recommend having 2 lights going at all times for that purpose, simply so that, and yes, you can check on them and whatever, but even if you check on them before you go to bed and then you check on them again first thing in the morning, that's still a potential 8-hour window where they were off of heat, in potentially in the 30s or in the 20s. So you want to make sure you're on top of that, especially if you're brooding outside, which we do. You can, if you're doing a small amount of birds, a lot of people do them in a tub in their garage with a heat lamp. That works too. Those heat lamps can cause fires. So make sure that you don't have it sitting against the plastic or sitting up against the wood shavings or something like that, because you don't want to wake up to, pre-broiled chicken, I guess. Like, you don't want to flame broil them that young. All right. So something to consider. Definitely recommend having the 2 heat lamps. And then, of course, when you've got your brooder set up, we have ours, and the way I recommend doing it, especially if you're doing a larger quantity of birds, is we've built our brooder outside. It's got a roof, it's got ventilation, but it's got a dirt floor. The nice thing about that is you create your own ecosystem in your brooder. So I like to use the pine shavings. I think that that's the best for doing the birds. I usually get an 11-foot cubic, packed cubic bag of the shavings, and that's like a brick, I should say. And usually one of those bricks will last me about a batch and a half to 2 batches of birds while they're in the brooder cycling through. And the cool thing is that you're basically creating warmth. As you add a little bit of fresh shavings every few days, you're creating that layer of warmth and compost underneath and their own little ecosystem, which is good. It's going to cut down on your cost for raising your own poultry, and it's going to provide warmth for them. You want to make sure that your birds aren't too hot and they aren't too cold. So keeping an eye on their behavior will help you determine that. You can also, of course, check the temperature in there, stick a thermometer, see what it's like at the floor level, underneath the heat lamps to see if you've got it too low and you're cooking them or what, but you can generally tell by their behavior, especially if you have a larger quantity of birds like that, because they'll go off to the corners as far away from the heat as they can, or they'll be huddled together. I like to start weaning them off of heat when I start to see the first signs of their adult feathers come in, and you'll hear that referred to as when your bird is feathering out. So usually that'll happen somewhere around the 2-week mark. So I like to start raising the heat lamp around then and get them off of heat. When you start raising that heat lamp up, it forces them to feather out a little bit. And then I get to the point where, like right now, I have a batch that's ready to go to pasture next week. They're off heat completely now in their half of the brooder. The other half, I just got another batch, my last batch of 50 chicks today. They've got their 2 heat lamps going on their lowest level that I keep them at, and they're good to go. So that kind of helps, alleviate some of the, why aren't my birds feathering out? I don't understand. They're not ready to go out to the pasture yet because they still have just their down. Well, if you keep them under that heat, it's going to take them longer to feather out. So you do want to raise that heat lamp up. It will help them feather out a little bit faster. You want to do it too fast because they're still babies and they're still growing, and they do grow incredibly fast. They're like little dinosaurs. They just go one day and they kind of grow faster than their feathers a lot of times. So you'll see little patchy areas on them because they literally do grow faster than their feathers. Usually by around the 6-week mark, they will be as feathered out as they're going to be. Usually by then you'll see all the adult feathers that are going to grow in have grown in, and they don't have any of those patchy areas anymore. Typically that's around the 6-week mark, I've found, where they don't look like science projects anymore. They don't look like science experiments where they've got these patchy areas where they had like a growth spurt over their left wing, and it happens though. So they're really not as high maintenance as they sound. I just saw one comment out of the corner of my eye. They really aren't. It's once you kind of get it down, it's just sort of knowing what you need. A lot of people sort of go into it thinking, oh, how hard can it be to raise a chicken? And then they panic because they don't know what they're doing. And it's really very simple to raise your own birds if you have the time and the space for it. So you got to think about in your brooder, they will go through a lot of water. They do drink a lot of water. The first few days, you want to make sure that you're feeding them around the clock, that they have access to food constantly. And we'll get into the feed probably in our next live next week about that. But you want to make sure the first few days that they have access to food all the time. And of course, water throughout their lives is going to be a constant. You're never going to withhold the water. I had somebody actually ask me once if the 12 hours on, 12 hours off thing meant no water. And I was like, no, they have to have water. But the problem is with these birds in particular, they are little gluttons. They will eat until they literally burst their stomachs. I'm not kidding. They will eat themselves to death. So you really have to make sure after those first couple of days where they're just really fluffy little chicks, they look like typical little Easter egg chickens that you'd see advertised around Easter, those little yellow puffballs. After those first few days, and I would say somewhere between the first, usually you'll get them at the 3-day mark. So I would say between 3 to 5 or 3 to 7 days, depending on the birds and how healthy they were when they arrived or how healthy they were when you got them. Somewhere in that range. Then I would start going 12 hours on, 12 hours off with their feed. And making sure for those 12 hours that they have access to feed, that they have access to feed that entire time. And then when it's time to pull it, you pull it. So meaning if you feed them at 6 in the morning, You make sure that they have enough feed to get them through until 6 at night. If you go out there and check and they still have feed, you pull it. You don't let them have any more until 6 in the morning the next day. So you want them 12 hours on and 12 hours off for the remainder of their life, until butchering day, of course. Butchering day, I'll typically just feed them the day before a little bit. Usually we butcher first thing in the morning, so you do want to kind of empty out their stomachs a little bit, their crops. It's easier to butcher them that way. And if they're pastured, they still have access to the grasses and whatever, but you're not feeding them their feed. For, some people will say 2 days before. I don't like to do it that long before. I do a day, but both are acceptable. So you just want to make sure, you've got that water available all the time, especially as we get more and more into summer. And if you're in a place that's very warm, you want to make sure that they have shade as well and access to clean, fresh water. So we like to, at the 4-week mark, just about at the 4-week mark, they're feathered out enough, and we like to move them to pasture. We have a chicken tractor, which if you've watched some of our other videos, you've seen the chicken tractor. And then we're able to just move that chicken tractor to a new piece of pasture every day or so, depending on the amount of birds we have in there. And they go through and eat the grass, they eat the bugs, and then you just pick them up and move them. So there's no bedding to worry about at that point. So that's actually saving you. And it's helping the pasture grow back, and it's helping it mow down. It's a good little ecosystem that you've got going on there where, they're eating the pasture, the bugs and that, and they're leaving some lovely, manure behind, some lovely droppings to enrich the soil for later on for, planting or whatever you want to do. So all of that works out in your favor if you have access to be able to pasture those birds. It also helps them live a little bit longer. I've found if they're pastured, if you keep them cooped up, they tend to eat and they're not exercising. So then you're getting into a scenario which is very similar to like the industrially raised birds that are in warehouses where they're kept in a closed pen. They're not outside, they're not foraging, they're not being active. So they basically just eat and sit. And so with them being outside, I found they do a lot better than if you were to keep them in like a kennel or something, or a different kind of enclosure where they can't scratch and forage. Their meat comes out better, I think, as well, because it's also healthier for you because they're eating those plants, which is giving them that chlorophyll. It does all kinds of wonderful things for you. But we'll get into that more in the next live, about their feed and what that does for you and what the difference that makes. So I think we're going to stop there for today. We're going to get into next week. We're going to talk about the feed. We're going to talk about the importance of the quality of the feed that you're going to feed them when you've decided to raise your own birds. We're going to talk about what you need, the tools you need for when you're butchering your birds, all the items that you need to think about having, and whether or not you are actually physically going to be the one butchering, or if you're going to try to hire it out, or how you're going to do that. And we're going to talk about space. If you're doing it just for yourself and you need the freezer space, or you're going to can it, or thinking about some different options as far as how you're going to preserve this for just your family. So we're going to go ahead and we'll stop there on my list for now. In fact, I'm even going to put a little mark just so I know where we left off on my notes. But and then I'll talk to you guys for a minute. But hi guys, welcome. Exactly, Twin Flames Ranch. Yeah, I think it's important to, let those birds be birds. Let them forage, let them do their thing. A lot of people do like to kind of just pen them in because they do grow so fast. It's easy if you don't have the space to just kind of stick them in like a run or a kennel or something. And you can, but you're going to get a lot more benefits if you're able to put them outside on some kind of pasture or grass. It's going to be easier for you to care for them too, because especially those I would say really the last 2 weeks, the amount of poop is no joke. So if you've got them in a situation where you're still having to change bedding, you're literally going to be changing the bedding at that point twice a day, because it will literally just turn into nastiness. So that's just something to consider when it comes to your butchering and all of that. I don't know what super chat is. I don't think I have it turned on because I don't know what it is. So that would be why it's not working, because I don't have it turned on. I have not researched that. What is super chat? I don't know. No, Rooster Slap, they don't get a choice of their last meal. They don't. I do that with my pigs. I usually try to make something special, like for their last meal, so they can have, like, they love chicken. So I usually make sure I make like a chicken soup or something that they can have like the carcass and the scraps from, because that's like a treat to them. So I usually try to give them something yummy for their last meal. But the chickens, not really, because they're pastured, so they get their bugs and whatever. So yes, they do. They do. I don't know what that means, YouTube. I'm sorry. I don't know. Yes, so it's definitely fun. Like, if you decide to raise your own birds, it's a lot of fun. It can be a lot of work, but once you kind of get the hang of it, it gets easier, because you have all the equipment you need. Because that's, when you're setting up your brooder, you got to think about your water, you got to think about your feeders and your heat lamps and all of those kind of initial setup expenses that you won't have to spend again. You'll have to change the heat lamp bulbs. Eventually those will burn out, but you'll have the heat lamps, for a while. The feeders you can use for a while. The waters you can use for a while. Like, obviously the bedding is something that's going to be having to be replaced and purchased new again and again and again. But you feel like a cooped up chicken in New York City. I bet you do. Robert, yes, that's awesome. You got 6 broad-breasted white turkeys. I actually have 6 broad-breasted white turkeys myself right now. In fact, I'm going to be moving them out to pasture with the chickens for a little while in the tractor, and get them out of the brooder, because they're at that stage right now where they're starting to like to fly and perch up higher in the brooder, and I don't want them to hit the heat lamps on the other side. So I usually do somewhere between, well, I usually do broad-breasteds. I think last 2 years I did like 15. One year we did bronze breasted, which was just more of a pain to pluck because they have darker pin feathers, so it's harder to get the meat completely cleaned out of the pin feathers. Harder to because they show up, they leave like a little stain. It doesn't look the same, but we usually do around 15 or so. But this year I bred, and I do some of our own, because we also have blue slate. I have royal palm this year that I'm not breeding, but because they're too young still, they won't be ready for the season. But next year I'll be breeding them. I have my blue slate, I have my midgets, so my midget whites. So I have a whole incubator full of turkey eggs right now that are just days away. I think I'm at the 9-day mark today. So hopefully, next weekend I will have little baby poults going, but I do have my broad breasteds, and it's obviously those grow a little faster than the heritage breeds that I have, and those, I have some people that have really big families that like to buy the bigger birds from us. So we do some that are going to be, more in the 20 to 30 pound range, and then we have our heritage breeds that are going to be more in the 12 to 18 pound, if we're lucky, range. So some of those toms do get pretty big. The midgets won't usually get that big, but some of the blue slate, we had one that was, I think, around 17 or 18, if memory serves. But that's more unusual for them to get quite that big. Especially because of the way, which I've talked about before, what we feed them. I'm not feeding them any corn or any soy, so they're not bulking up. They're eating really healthy grains and protein. So, and they get, their grape leaves and their grasses and stuff over there as well. So they're not eating, they're not shoved in a kennel and just force-fed corn. So they don't get as big, but they're healthier for you to consume. So you couldn't pay me to live in the city either. I grew up in the city, and kept moving further and further away. So don't name the birds. Well, there's too many to name, Edward, so I don't generally name them. Oh yes, Robert, definitely. Big Toms. We did smoked the breast meat, and I want to do that this year too. In fact, I have two that are a crossbreed that are actually two Jennies, but they're decent size. I mean, they're not huge, but we're a small family, so I want to do those. I want to get those guys butchered here before they get too much older and smoke them. So I think that'll be pretty awesome. And they're a cross between the blue slate and the midget. So I kind of am anxious to try that meat combination, because midget turkeys have a darker meat, and the blue slates, and they're very flavorful, and the blue slates also have a very different kind of flavor to them. So I'm kind of curious to see how that blends out. No, I don't think that they know, Ray. In fact, we're going to be butchering our last pig of the season this Saturday. Joan, we'll be butchering her this weekend. So I'll be making sausage next week and all of that, and he'll be doing the bacon, and we'll be smoking all that. So I'm sure he'll be videoing some of that as well, even though we've made some of those videos. Again, we like to, you know, it's one of those things where, you know, there's always trying something new or doing something a little different that we can kind of try it out and see how it goes. So hi, Jennifer. Hi, guys. Oh my goodness. Sorry, trying to keep up with some of these comments as they fly by. Yeah, so anyway, so that's part one there of our chick chat. And I think next week we'll get into part two. Like I said, we'll talk about some of those other things that I mentioned about the butchering supplies, what to feed them, and kind of getting into that side of it a little bit more. But anyway, I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope maybe you learned something. Maybe not. Maybe you already knew. Maybe it's intrigued you about getting your own meat birds and raising your own little flock so that you can not have to buy chicken at the store. And we'll get into that a little bit more next week when we talk about the feed and how much healthier it is for you and all of that. So make sure you guys like the video and share it, and subscribe to the channel. Click the bell so you get the notifications, and make sure you're following us on Twitter, on Instagram, and Facebook. We are at the Crouch Ranch, and all that good stuff. And there you have it. So Mike and I will be doing a live on Sunday, hopefully around 1 o'clock. He'll be mid-butchering, I'm sure. Well, not butchering. I mean, he will be butchering, but he'll be breaking down the cuts that have been in the freezer overnight, getting firm, so that he can get those ribs and pork chops and loins and all that good stuff out. So yay, yay, yay. Well, that's the thing, is you work out. He's saying he doesn't see how I stay in good shape with all that good food, but it's moderation, because I think that's part of it too. Side note real quick is I think that you learn to appreciate when you're raising your own meat, or you know the people that are raising your meat. I think we tend not to be as gluttonous and don't sit down and eat an entire, you know, chicken by ourselves. It's, you know, it's appreciating and respecting the hard work that went into that. And you actually find yourself eating less meat. And that's kind of where I am. I don't eat as much meat because I know where it came from. I respect the sacrifice of it. I'm not saying that other people don't. I'm just saying that for me, that was kind of, you know, part of it for me. A small part of it, but definitely a part of it. I think it forces you to kind of acknowledge the hard work that goes into it and wanting it to kind of, you know, last longer. So, but thank you guys for tuning in. I know we had kind of a small group today, but that's okay. Hopefully you guys got your notifications and all of that. We'll see. But so we will be trying to go live on Sunday, and we'll see how that goes. And I hope everybody has a great rest of your day, and looking forward into the weekend here. And don't forget to like, share, subscribe, all that good stuff, and have a great rest of your day.